To understand what is unfolding, we have to be precise about the problem in front of us. This is not simply about Greenland, and it is not even primarily about military plans that may or may not exist inside the Pentagon. It is about what happens when a president refuses to take options off the table and when his party is no longer sure how to respond. For Republicans, this creates a uniquely uncomfortable bind. If they dismiss the idea as bluster, they risk being overtaken by their own administration's words. If they confront it directly, they risk a public break with a president who has repeatedly punished dissent. And if they stay silent, they allow a threat to a NATO ally to stand unanswered. What makes this moment different is that ambiguity is no longer theoretical. The White House has explicitly preserved the possibility of force. Cabinet officials have declined to deny it, and lawmakers are now being forced to decide whether to act or to look away. To see why this dilemma runs so deep, we have to look backward, not forward, and trace how this idea took shape in the first place. To understand how this moment became possible, we need to place it inside a longer historical and strategic arc. Greenland has never been just ice and distance. For the United States, it has long existed in the background of security planning, remote, strategically located, and politically uncomplicated, so long as alliances held. What kept that balance intact was not force, but trust, norms, the quiet assumption that allies are not objects to be acquired. That assumption is now eroding. Over time, American power has grown accustomed to optionality, the belief that every scenario deserves a plan, every obstacle can be pressured, every norm can be tested. Inside the Pentagon, contingency thinking is routine. Inside alliances, it is corrosive. When those two logics collide, ambiguity becomes a weapon. Donald Trump did not invent this tension, but he has stripped away the restraint that once managed it. What was previously unthinkable can now be spoken aloud. What was once hypothetical is now deliberately left unresolved. And once an idea enters the system, once it is repeated, defended, and left open, it begins to acquire momentum of its own. That momentum would soon collide with a moment that made this abstract tension impossible to ignore. The abstract suddenly became real in a single exchange on Capitol Hill. A Republican lawmaker asked what should have been an easy question. Was the Pentagon preparing plans to take Greenland by force, yes or no? It was a moment designed to restore normalcy, to close a door, to let everyone move on. That door never closed. Instead, the answer leaned on contingency, on preparation, on language that belongs inside war rooms, not alliance management. And when pressed again, the refusal to deny became the story itself. This was the first real crisis point, because it exposed something Republicans had hoped to avoid. The administration was no longer treating Greenland as hypothetical, and neither suddenly was Congress. What made this moment so destabilizing was not aggression, but evasion. The inability or unwillingness to say no. In Washington, ambiguity is power, but in alliances, it is alarm. If you're trying to understand how policy drifts before it breaks, pay attention to moments like this. Share this. Sit with it. These are the signals history often hides in plain sight. From here on, the question was no longer whether the idea existed, but what system was allowing it to survive. What keeps an idea like this alive is not enthusiasm. It is structure. The American national security system is built around preparation without commitment. Plans exist so leaders don't have to improvise. Options are preserved so leverage is never lost. In isolation, that logic makes sense. But when it migrates from defense to diplomacy, it quietly rewires relationships. Here is the hidden mechanism at work. By refusing to rule anything out, the White House shifts the burden of restraint away from itself and onto everyone else. Allies are left guessing. Lawmakers are forced into reaction. And silence begins to look like consent. For Republicans, this system is especially unforgiving. Party loyalty discourages confrontation. Institutional loyalty demands it. The result is paralysis, masked as caution. And once ambiguity becomes policy, it starts to normalize pressure. What begins as all options are on the table becomes coercion without fingerprints. Not an invasion, but a threat that never quite disappears. That is how norms erode, not through dramatic breaks, but through repeated refusals to draw lines. The consequences of that erosion were about to surface again, this time louder, faster, and harder to contain. The second rupture came not from the Pentagon, but from the political system scrambling to catch up. As the White House spoke more openly, lawmakers began doing something rare in this era. They reacted across party lines. Bipartisan statements appeared. Words like dangerous, unacceptable, and coercion entered the conversation. The tone shifted from dismissal to alarm. This was the second mini-crisis, because it revealed how far the situation had drifted. Republicans were no longer debating strategy in private. They were publicly warning a president of their own party about the collapse of an alliance. And yet, even here, restraint stopped short of action. Condemnation without consequence. Concern without closure. Military force was criticized but never fully removed from the table. That hesitation mattered because at the same time lawmakers were urging caution, the White House was doing the opposite, explicitly preserving every option. The gap between branches widened, so did the risk. When institutions speak in different voices, power doesn't pause, it accelerates. And that acceleration would soon land somewhere far more personal, on the lives of ordinary people watching this unfold. If all of this feels distant, abstract, elite, let me bring it closer to you. Because when governments normalize threats, it is never leaders who pay first. It is citizens, it is families, it is trust. Imagine being told that an ally is now a problem to be managed, that a peaceful partner might become a pressure point. When alliances weaken, uncertainty spreads downward, markets hesitate, security guarantees feel thinner, the world becomes less predictable, not more. And for Americans, this matters deeply. You are told that strength means never backing down. But real strength is knowing when restraint protects you, when silence in Washington creates noise everywhere else. Polls show this is not what people want. Not Republicans, not Democrats. Yet the system keeps drifting because no one quite stops it. This is how democratic accountability erodes not in a single vote, but in a series of moments when leaders assume you won't notice. If you're still watching, still listening, it's because you sense that something here is off. Share this. Talk about it. These choices are being made in your name. And the effects don't stop at America's borders. They ripple outward fast. Once alliances begin to wobble, the consequences are never contained. Greenland is not just a territory on a map. It is embedded in a network of commitments that define the post-war order. When the United States hints at coercion against a NATO-linked partner, every ally hears the same message. Guarantees are conditional. That message travels quickly. It reshapes calculations in capitals far beyond Denmark. If norms can be bent here, they can be bent elsewhere. If alliance rules depend on the mood of one leader, then deterrence itself becomes unstable. The danger is not an immediate conflict. It is miscalculation. Allies may hedge, rivals may probe, and the credibility that once prevented crises begins to thin. There is also a deeper irony. NATO was designed to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty, to ensure that power was constrained by commitment. Threatening force within that system doesn't just pressure one ally, it stresses the entire structure. History shows us that global instability rarely begins with deliberate war. It begins when trusted systems are quietly tested and found wanting. What happens next depends on which path this pressure ultimately forces us down. So where does this road lead? There are three plausible futures, and none of them are abstract. The first is the best-case scenario. Pressure fades, the rhetoric cools, Greenland quietly returns to being what it has long been, a strategic concern managed through cooperation, not coercion. Republicans avoid a vote. Alliances absorb the shock. The system bends, but does not break. The second is the muddled middle. Nothing dramatic happens, but nothing is resolved. Military options remain on the table. Congress hesitates, allies grow wary. The United States retains power, but loses trust. This is the slow erosion model, no single disaster, just a steady weakening of credibility. The third is the darkest path. Ambiguity hardens into action. A vote is forced. Republicans decline to block the president. And the United States crosses a line it has spent generations telling others never to cross. Not because it had to, but because it failed to stop itself. What matters here is not which scenario is chosen intentionally, but which one the system drifts into by default. History is shaped less by bold decisions than by unchallenged momentum. And that brings us to the final question, the one that ultimately defines moments like this. What kind of power does America choose to be? We often imagine history turning on grand speeches or decisive battles. In reality, it usually turns on quieter moments, on what leaders refuse to say and what institutions fail to stop. This is one of those moments. No one is asking for Greenland to be taken. Not the American public, not America's allies, and yet the option remains open, not because it must, but because closing it would require political courage. Power, at its most dangerous, is not aggression. It is indifference to consequences. The belief that strength means never drawing limits, even on yourself. That is how great powers lose the very systems that made them strong. Republicans now face a choice that will define more than a single presidency. They can treat this as another episode to manage, or they can recognize it as a line that, once crossed or even blurred, cannot easily be restored. For decades, America's power rested not just on force, but on trust, on alliances that believed its word meant restraint as much as resolve. That balance is fragile, and it does not survive neglect. If you want to understand where the world is heading, don't just watch what leaders do, watch what they allow. If this analysis helped clarify that moment for you, share it. Follow for what comes next, because this story isn't over, and the next chapter will depend on who decides to act and who decides to look away.